Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jad. I'm a revolutionary socialist living in Paris. Comrades from Britain have asked me to do a short 10-15 minutes video to talk about the Yellow Vest movement. So 15 minutes is not a very long time, so I'll try to focus on three important aspects. First of all, the general context in which this movement is emerging. Second, the movement itself. Who are these people? Especially with a look at the internal unevenness and contradictions. And third, what opportunities and challenges it poses for the forces of the radical left and the working class movement. Now, to begin, I think it's quite obvious by now that the fuel tax hike that was announced by Macron for the new year and which started the movement was only the straw which broke the camel's back. People didn't suddenly go insane and decided to set up barricades on the streets of Paris. In spite of what you might think, it doesn't happen every day in Paris. Now, this movement, it emerges after over a decade of global economic crisis and the severe austerity policies that were adopted by all the European governments. Of course, you're aware of this. In France, as in everywhere else, these policies have hit ordinary people, the poor, and the working class in general. And it is in this context that Macron is trying to apply further very violent neoliberal measures. So we have the classic recipe of tax cuts for the very rich, cuts to public services, privatization of public services, a tax on pensions and working rights, as well as what we call indirect taxation, so everyday taxes like the fuel tax, which of course mostly hit people who have less money. So even before the Yellow Vest movement emerged, there was a general acknowledgement, even for the mainstream right-wing media, that Macron is perceived as the president of the rich. No one really disagrees on this. And after barely a year in power, Macron was announced by the liberals and the Guardian as kind of the savior of the European neoliberal center. He is today the most unpopular president in the history of France. So he has a 20% approval rating. He managed to break the previous record low that was set by François Hollande, who had himself broken Nicolas Sarkozy's record. So basically, for the past 10 years, we've had 3 presidents in France, each with a new record low in ratings. So this gives you a general idea of how people have been feeling for a while now in France. So in this context, we've had a very sharp polarization, which again is in various ways what is happening throughout Europe and throughout the world, really. On the one hand, the past few years have seen a high level of class struggle, large sectors of the working class going on strike, university, high school students occupying their schools and universities, undocumented migrants, various anti-racist movements, and some very radical left movements emerging from within these struggles. And at the same time, there is a polarization to the right. It's basically, one statistic is enough. In the last election in 2017, the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen got something like 10-11 million votes. So it is in this general context that the Yellow Vest movement emerged. From the beginning, I think it's important to state this, that the vast majority of the people taking part in this movement are working class. They may be in work, they may be unemployed, they may be retired, they may be, juggling between 2-3 jobs to make ends meet. They're all saying 2 things, basically. First, they don't have enough money, they can't make ends meet. And second, they hate Macron and they want him to resign. However, another very important thing is that this movement is really outside of the organized working class. We're talking about people who are not unionized. 1 in 2 working people in France have never been part of a union. Those are people who usually live far from their large towns. They live in perhaps smaller towns, even rural villages. They work in small workplaces. And very often they have to travel 20-30 miles every day to get to their job. And so fuel is usually a major expense, which is why this tax is so hated. But this also means that a minority of the movement are small business owners who want less taxes, but of course they are opposed to, for instance, raising wages, because this means that they will have to pay their workers more. So it goes without saying that you never find any business owners on traditional working class mobilizations that are usually organized by unions. So what is more, although the most visible demonstrations are in Paris, the most spectacular ones with the riots and everything, this is a movement which is very, very fragmented geographically. So the larger demonstrations are in the big cities, but actually the most participants in the Yellow Vest movements, usually you will find them on smaller gatherings of usually hundreds of people all over the country. Typically they block roads. This is the main action so far. All of this means that the movement is very uneven. It has a very uneven ideology. People are getting in motion using symbols that are not usual for the left, that are not usual for the working class movement, like the French flag, like singing the national anthem, saying that, you know, the police should be on their side, and things like that. This is stuff that we're not used to in the traditional left movements. What is more, many members of the far right have tried to hijack the movement on social media and to appear as its representatives. Now, I'll go back to this point a bit later, but in fact, this movement has not one single representative because it is very fragmented in nature. So we will go to every roadblock and you will hear very similar things and you will also hear very different things. So many participants, for instance, have explicitly rejected attempts by the far right to impose themselves on them, on the gatherings and on social media. So in many instances, you know, some fascist groups have been kicked out of Gilets Jaunes mobilization, Yellow Vest mobilization. Now, what this tells us is that people are getting into struggle, but using common sense ideas that perhaps they have accepted uncritically. You know, stuff like, we're all French, we're all in this together, there shouldn't be any difference between the rich and the poor, or the police are here to protect us. You know, you hear this everywhere. Or even in a minority of cases, homophobic or racist ideas, which is not altogether surprising given the racism of Le Pen, of course, but also the mainstream political parties and the media over the years. So all the mainstream parties, including the center-left, have resorted to racism and Islamophobia at one point or another. So this brings me to my third and last point, which is, you know, how can we intervene in this as the radical left, and how does the working class movement relate to this? Well, of course we can say, which is really the sectarian attitude, which is, well, we don't like the symbols that they're using, we're not really into the French flag, we're not into the French national anthem, so we're going to stay at home, we want nothing to do with it. This is, I think, a disastrous position, of course, but to be honest, only even at the beginning, when we didn't really know what this movement was about, there was a bit of confusion, and some people said, well, we shouldn't participate in it at all. But I think that today it is only a small minority of the radical left is saying this. So that's not really a big problem today. The other, more widespread reaction is simply jumping on the bandwagon, saying everything is great. We'll turn a blind eye to the racist majority and all will be well. So it's like saying, well, the Yellow Vests represent the real French people as opposed to, say, the organized working class. This is also another exaggeration, which I think is quite dangerous. However, as the movement goes on, I think large sections of the radical left, of the anti-racist movement, of the working class movement, are realizing that what we need to do is to intervene in this. It is to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Yellow Vest, in spite of our differences, but to bring our ideas and our arguments. So not just go there and, you know, pretend that all is great and not sit at home. We need to intervene and bring our ideas to the movement. I think the simple reason for that is that if you look at the Yellow Vests, there is very clearly a big difference between what ideas they may have and what they're actually doing. So for instance, people who think that, which is really a common sense idea when you're outside the radical left, it's a common sense idea to think that the police are here to protect us. After spending a day, fighting off the cops on the Champs-Élysées, these ideas might start to change. So the fact that they're struggling is actually helping to change their ideas. And by the way, I think it's important to state that the violence comes mainly from the police. A very serious right-wing, actually, newspaper said that the police fired 10,000 grenades on Saturday in Paris alone. So this gives you, I think, over the day, someone did the calculation, it's one grenade every 4 or 5 seconds on average. I think 6 or 7 people so far have had their hands amputated. A young man is in a coma after being shot with a rubber bullet to the head, really at a very close range. And we just learned that an 80-year-old woman just died in Marseille after being targeted by a police grenade while she was in her apartment. Actually, her window was open and she was targeted with a grenade. She died a couple of days later in the hospital. So we see where the violence is coming from, and actually millions of people are seeing where the violence is coming from, and without having read far left propaganda about what the police are here for, I think many of them are starting to change their mind because they have a first-hand experience of the police, and they're starting to realize that perhaps the police are actually here to protect the rich. So this is only a small example which shows that when people get first-hand experience, their ideas can change. And another preconceived idea is that some people in the Yellow Vest movement had was that trade unions were useless and they're only looking out for their own sectional interests. And others, on the other hand, were saying from the beginning, well, where are the trade unions? They should join us and they should help us. But and the trade union bureaucracy, so the heads of the big trade union federations, were kind of careful with this. At first they said, well, blocking roads is all very fine, but really, the Yellow Vests should join us and they should strike, and this is how you this is how you win. You need to strike and everything, which is of course true, but it's perhaps not the best way of putting it. But what is very interesting is that locally, and this is a trend that has been accelerating in the past few days. We've had local convergences between the Yellow Vests and local trade union sections. Both are realizing that they need each other to win. And they've been joining on demonstrations. They've been having popular meetings together to try and discuss things. This is very, very positive. It's all happening under the slogan of Yellow Vests and Red Vests together, the Red Vests being the trade unions, of course. And finally, sections of the anti-racist movement have decided to join the demonstrations, bringing their own anti-racist demands into the movement. I think this is also a very important move, because if we can learn one thing from what's been happening in France in the past few years, is that what we may call traditional class struggle, strikes, demonstrations, and occupations, do not magically reduce racism. They are, of course, they create a favorable environment, I think, for anti-racists, but they do not, it's not like there's a magic wand that makes racism disappear. Marine Le Pen got 11 million votes in 2017, which was a year of strikes, demonstrations, occupations, and things like that. We need a specific struggle against racism inside the Yellow Vest movement and inside the movement altogether, and we need to kick the far right out. Not only because we want to purify the movement, make it a nicer movement, a more inclusive movement, of course this is true, but because I think it's a strategic question. One doesn't really need to be an expert or a prophet to know that the French ruling class will use racism and Islamophobia whenever they are in trouble. So, just to finish with this, you've all seen the images of riots and barricades in Paris. It's all very nice. They're a reminder of what happened in May 68. But for now, the economic impact of the Yellow Vest movement is not so big. In May 68, the economic impact was huge because there was also, at the same time, the largest general strike in the history of the country. So Macron is already in big trouble politically because of the Yellow Vest movement. What we need now is more strike actions. It's really blocking the economy. something that can really finish him off, finish his government off. This will not come, I think, with a call from above. It will come from below. Strikes need to be built in every workplace. And the tendency, this local convergence between the working class movement and the Yellow Vest, between the anti-racist movement and the Yellow Vest, makes me cautiously optimistic. So I'll end it here. Thank you.